Hi, we are live. This is Maha Bali from the American University in Cairo in Egypt, and we're doing our second Equity and studio visit. We have with us today our guests Saba and Sherry, but we also have a lot of great people who are going to introduce themselves now. I'll ask Mia and Catherine to go first, and then I'm going to write the alphabetical order in the chat so other folks can introduce themselves. And the topic today is equity.
Hi, everyone. So it's so great to be here. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. And hopefully we'll have some viewers on the outside texting us or using Twitter, the hashtag UnboundEq in order to ask questions if they come up live. I'm Mia Zamora. I'm saying hello from New Jersey. I'm an associate professor of English here at Kean University, and I'm very pleased to be a co-facilitator of Equity Unbound with Maha and Catherine. So passing the baton to Catherine.
Okay, great. Thanks, Mia and Maha. Yes, Mia, Maha, and I conceived of this idea for Equity Unbound earlier this year, and we've been working on it through the summer, and it's been such a joy just to see it come alive with all of you. So thank you so much. I think we're going to have longer introductions in a few minutes, so I'll just say that I am sitting at 9 p.m. in Galway in Ireland, and go on to the rest of the introductions then.
Okay. That's me. Hi, I'm Bonnie Stewart. I am in Windsor, Ontario, in Canada, and I am in the Faculty of Education here at Windsor, and I'm delighted to be here talking to all of these faces.
Hi, I'm Clarissa Sorensen Unruh, and I am a professor of chemistry at Central New Mexico Community College, and I am in New Mexico, Albuquerque, New Mexico right now. So it's like two here. Woo! Sorry.
Hi, I am Lillian Riggling. I am the program coordinator at eCampus Ontario, which is a nonprofit that does tech-enabled learning and open education in the province of Ontario. And I am here in Toronto, Ontario, in what appears to be a catering hallway at a conference. So if you hear some noise, I'm sorry.
Hi, I'm Saba, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow with the Surveillance Studies Center at Queen's University here in Kingston, Ontario. Lots of Ontario people here, which is nice to see.
Hi, I'm Sherry Spalitz, and I am an elementary physical education specialist, and I teach in Vienna, Austria, and I'm thrilled to be here for this conversation.
Hi, I'm Sakina Walaji, and I'm sitting here at 10 p.m. in Cape Town, South Africa. And I'm based at the University of Cape Town in the Centre for Innovation in Learning and Teaching. I work in working with faculty and educators in developing online and blended courses. Thanks, great to be here, and congratulations to the organizers of this course. It's been amazing following it through. Thank you.
Thank you, Sakina, and thank you, everybody. So to kick us off, and I'm going to start with Sherry and Saba because they're our guests of honor today. I also like to hear from everyone else, but Sherry and Saba, between you, you can answer one of two questions, either a kind of equity or inequity that you noticed recently that you'd like to share and discuss with us, or how your own hybrid identity influenced your views of equity and inequity. So whoever's ready to start.
I'll start. And I don't know which question I really want to answer, because I was thinking about a recent equity topic, and I teach small children. So I teach children from between the ages of 4 and 11. And I work in a K-12 school, so I see kids of all ages. And I think, I see inequity, I see unfairness all the time. And it's as simple as someone who simply steps to the front of the line and there's an uproar. But he just cut, and the conversations that we have around something that seems as simple as that, but it really is about respect. It's about how are we dealing with each other? How we see things differently. And so I think one of the things that I'm dealing with constantly is deciding how much time and airspace and energy shall we give to this particular conflict. Is it something that can be resolved among the parties involved, 3 6-year-olds? Or is it something that requires my intervention? Or is it time? Or is it a case where, oh, Mrs. Shpelitz is about to give us that talk, and they know that, they know the look, they know the tone of voice that signals, oh, now she's going to give us that talk about fairness and about how we deal with each other. So, given that backdrop, I think equity is sort of always playing in my mind. It's always present. And well, actually, I shouldn't say equity. It's always inequity, right? That's the source of the conflict. That's the thing that we're seeing or not seeing, or feeling and vocalizing or not vocalizing. So I just think it's part of my day to day. So it's hard to isolate a single incident.
As you were saying that, I was thinking about when this happens in my class, and they're undergrads, so they're adults, right? And when in a conversation I see that, it's difficult to decide whether to let the other students respond to someone who's expressing bias or expressing some kind of insensitivity to inequity, or whether I step in. On the one hand, you want to, you have your values that you want to make sure that, you don't want to be untrue to your values. But you also realize that you have power in the classroom, and so when you say something, it's different than when other students say it. And at the same time, you don't want someone to be hurting someone else and stand by and let it happen. And it's a constant struggle, especially this semester. And my students might be watching this later, so they'll know what I'm talking about. Do others have comments or follow-ups to what Sherry was talking about?
I think it made me think about what you said, Sherry, about trying to figure, and I think Mia kind of noted it, trying to figure out how much time and energy and whether to step in or not, it really speaks to me, because in some cases, depending on who we are in the room, in context with everybody else, do we call something out? Do we not call something out? Do we, making those decisions in those moments requires us to kind of evaluate power structures, evaluate what's happening between kids or not. And it's not easy to do, right? It's something you kind of do through life, and you're like, all right, now I recognize I can do it here, or you try it out, or you kind of figure out, let me try a little bit, or just like you said, Sherry, they're like, oh, now she's going to give us the talk or whatever. But it's like, would it be solved with just a look, with them knowing you'll give them the talk and they sort it out? Sometimes, it's an interesting kind of way to approach it and and kind of figure out how to call it out. And I'm also saying this as someone who is often the least white person in a room in many cases. And in times like that, it does fall to us to kind of bring up certain things. And I'm happy to do that. But it's also a little bit of a you end up becoming that person in the room. And sometimes if you're in a position of being an instructor or with a group of other people, or if you're, depending on your relationship to everybody else in the room, it's fraught, is I guess what I'm trying to say. Because you don't want to be that person, but you still want to be that person in a way that's helpful and useful to other people.
You can't help being that person too, right?
I think fraught is one of my favorite words in general, and I feel that so many of the issues that I face with my students, and it's interesting because I always think, oh, but I teach 5, 6, 7-year-olds, and I feel like I know how they operate, but they always surprise me, and in that I also find that I surprise myself, because realizing that I don't necessarily need to give that talk. Often that if I can structure it a little bit, that they can kind of let each other know what's happening. So I think, but fraught, that notion of damned if in some cases, damned if I do, damned if I don't. And that whole notion of calling out, being that the least white person in the room as well, being in that situation, certainly in my institution, they're all that those things come up again and again. So I want to leave some airtime for other folks.
I can jump in once more if you want, to let people gather their thoughts. What you were saying about, I also think there's an interesting dynamic where sometimes, even though I, like we were saying, that I'm the only non-white person in the room, and everybody in the room means well, they want to, in fact, my colleagues and coworkers, a lot of them are very, very keen on ensuring equity and being more inclusive and, doing all of that stuff. But it's always a little bit of a means well kind of situation where, like, I know you mean well, but you need to step up. And I was recently at a conference where we were trying to think about ways in which to support academic workers if they're dealing with some sort of harassment. And I think one of the things that I said, and I don't know, I hope it's appropriate to say here, I apologize if it's not, but weaponizing white dudes in a way which is those people who mean well, take them to task with that and be like, all right, you're in this room, you want to, like, given that I'm not the person in power, and if we want to create a more equitable setting for people in our community, then step up and do the thing that makes that so, instead of saying that I support this and I want this to be true. But also when someone says that, I want to be that person in the room saying, okay, so what are you doing? How can people approach you if they feel like there needs to be a little bit more done? Can we set up a thing? So having people identify themselves as people who will, in unequal power structures like academia, having people who we know have access to that a lot easier, make themselves very available to the rest of us, saying, like, if any of this happens, and if you need someone to do a thing, come to me and I will make that happen. So instead of just having someone mean well and promise to support you, have someone put themselves in the line of fire and be, kind of opt into that in a way. Because I know that I can go to some of my colleagues, but I also don't know. So I'd like my colleagues to be like, if you need this, come to me very clearly, rather than me saying like, hey, so would you be willing to? Do you know what I mean? So, like, kind of flipping that where we don't have to ask for it, but those people will say, like, if there needs to be something done, come to me and I will help you with it. I don't know. I hope this is relevant to what we're talking about.
I think it absolutely is. I actually really love the idea of sort of weaponizing white dudes or whiteness in general, because we all have these, different power axes on which we're positioned, and our social location isn't always totally visible. But if you are able to, if you happen to have whiteness along one of those axes, certainly where I live, there's a lot of rooms in which that operates differently and can be something that you can use and go, hey, just hang on here. I recognize that my voice may be heard differently. One of the things that came up for me when Sherry was speaking about listening to the 6-year-olds and about sort of examples of inequity, being all around, being always with us. Absolutely. And I mean, I have 2 kids, and there are daily inequities and power struggles. But I've seen certain types of inequities reified on a large news scale so much recently, that I feel as if some of the things that I'm saying to my kids about, let's be aware of our power and our social location, and let's consider fairness and all these things, is almost being actively undermined by so much of the operation, the visible and I'm not saying it's new, but the very, very visible operations of power at governmental levels, not solely in the US, here at home as well. And I'm struggling with that. And I think part of my response to it has been to do some unpacking and find rage that I haven't had full access to in a while, and probably should have, to the point where I'm almost having to check that now and wondering, am I over raging? Am I wasting my energy on things that I can't affect change on? Am I taking this frustration at the whole sphere and social contract and moment in which we're in, and directing it in places it shouldn't go, or it's gonna lie fallow on? And I don't really know what to do with that. So I just thought I'd throw that out in case any of you have some nice life advice.
Hi. So I wanted to say that really resonated with me, Bonnie, about feeling so much all of a sudden with this political climate, with the world that we live in, and the just supreme amount of access to media and stories about this like lack of equity and balance in our world. And I walk through the world and I'm so angry, but I also feel like I walk through the world with an enormous amount of privilege. And if I can feel this inequity coming down on me, what have I missed, and where have I been a perpetrator of that inequity in the past, 10, 15 years? But when I got to walk through the world sort of blissfully unaware of a lot of these issues, and as my awareness grows, my sort of fear of having been a bad actor in the past also grows. And I don't, I don't know if I'm letting all that rage from the past just creep into this one moment now where I have something to cling to and point to and say, this is not okay. And I worry about us when we I loved that we were saying, or you were saying, when is it time to intervene? When is it time to let go? How much energy do we have to expend on the anger and on the rage, and how much do we have? How can we just let it go, and how can we move forward instead of exiling people that are bad actors? How can we work to reconcile those equities?
I've actually, speak on that as well. I think I've really found that the more that I get ragey, and my 12-year-old just thinks I'm mad about everything. It's like he doesn't know what to pay attention to in terms of like, oh, now mom's mad about this and mom's mad about that. But in my own personal life, I find myself looking to people who have felt rage longer. And almost always that someone like people of color, people who have had more to be ragey about for longer than I have. And I'm new to this rage, and I'm trying to come to a place where I'm listening more than I'm talking, because it just feels like a lot of folks that have felt this rage for a longer time have a way to channel it in a way that I am unused to. Does that make any sense?
That's what it does. I think I think all of us, we all kind of feel this in our individual realities, because a lot of this is happening, and like someone was saying, there's so much information and you don't know how much rage and what to do with it and where to direct it. And I think there are no answers. Bonnie, I'm sorry. But I think the answer is basically to allow that rage to live in some way and figure out how to channel it. And that's really hard to do. And I'm speaking as, a brown person, but I'm not without my privileges, like within various privilege, and that's very contextual, isn't it? Like in some situations I'm less privileged, and in other situations I'm more privileged, and identifying where I lie in any given interaction kind of informs how I act in that setting. And I think a lot of what this rage seems to do, especially when, and I really take to heart what you're saying, Bonnie, where you're trying to talk to people in your life about inequities and kids and stuff like that, whereas everything in the world is just telling them a very different story. And it's really hard to bring those two together. And I guess the only thing we can do is to keep pointing at it and keep naming it and keep saying this is right or this is wrong or this is complicated, and how do we talk through that, and how do we, because it's all we can do. And I think I was trying to figure out I was finishing my dissertation when a lot of this was coming out, and it felt so useless. Like it felt like this thing that I'm doing has no worth compared to everything that's happening in the world. But what that made me also do was like, all right, I need to find where I am most useful and how I can affect change in whatever small way, wherever I am. And I think going back and forth between feeling this rage and being like, and then coming back to, all right, what can I do here right now with my neighbor, with my friend, with my partner, whoever it is, in order to kind of further that conversation in a particular way. And by that I don't mean engage with people online, because I don't think that that's useful in any way, unless they're people that we care about, obviously. But what I also changed is something I tried to check with my rage was like who I directed it to. And I remember that, you know, I have friends or family that would say things that worried me, and I would, before this, I would just lash out at them and ignore them or dismiss them. And now I've changed over to being like, all right, you're the person who's worth my time and energy to have this conversation with and engage with. So I'm going to do that. Like, I'm not going to dismiss you like I dismiss internet trolls, but I'm going to be like, all right, let's talk about this and think about where this is coming from. And I think that has made a difference. Like, in a weird way, it's made me, and I know you already had a session on this, but it's made me more empathetic to people in my life, to be like, all right, take deep breaths. Let me think about where you are on this, and let's see how we can kind of sort that out or address that in some way. And I think a lot of us, we have our own communities where we can tap into them and be like, what are you doing with your rage? How can I help? And we can all talk to each other like this and be like, here are different ways in which we can probably do it. Or we can commiserate with each other and be like, yeah, it really sucks. And it's nice to have someone to be able to say that with as well. I don't know if this, I mean, this is equity related, but I think this is also becoming very like, how do we support each other in a time of great and you know, soon to happen scary inequity stuff. So
I'll jump in. I popped something into the chat, but it was really about sort of coping with the sort of feeling of being overwhelmed with all the different things that you have to think about. I think it's just the thinking time. First of all, there isn't enough of it. And then what do you do about it? So it's around self-care, and whether it's, you know, withdrawing from the world and you know, the bigger world, just shutting off, regrouping, but that also feels cowardly sometimes. You know, do you pick your battles? Because actually you can't do everything. So I think that's something I've been thinking about, you know, whether that's self-care health-wise or self-care in terms of focusing on what is working. And yeah, just maybe changing direction. And Maha, I think you wanted to expand on this, perhaps.
Yeah, I was just thinking about what you were saying and whether it's cowardly. And when I was finishing my dissertation, my daughter was like 1 and a bit years old. There was a lot of political uproar in Egypt, including a lot of violence. And what would happen to me when I watched TV of some of the violence and the bad news that's happening is that my breast milk would stop flowing. And so at that point, I was like, okay, this is not worth it. Like, my child's well-being means that I need to stop watching this news and thinking about the positive ways I can do something about it, but not constantly listening to the news that was affecting me this way. So I think there are times when your priorities mean that you need to do this compartmentalization for a while so that you can survive that moment and then move on. Hi, Elizabeth.
Oh, sorry. Hi, everyone. Sorry for joining the conversation late. I'll just find my mute.
I'd like to respond to that. My voice is struggling here, so sorry about that. Maha, that was very powerful, just what you recounted there about breastfeeding. My goodness. I finished my PhD earlier this year, and last year, 2017, in August, I had an experience which has recurred several times since then, but it was probably the most powerful time of it that I'd had in recent years, and that was after the events happened in Charlottesville last year. I was in my office in the university feeling like the world was on fire, and I was writing up this thesis. So it was that kind of rage energy that was compelling me to want to go out and speak and march and do, and yet I was doing this academic work. So I don't know if anybody else has found that. Now, fortunately, I had some very wise friends who said, "Catherine, you are this close," and I was very close. Finish your thesis and then do the work. But it has been a really difficult year as someone who is an ally, as some of us have been saying, who really has been involved in a lot of social justice struggles in different ways over many years. I grew up in New York City in the late 60s and early 70s, and this is the narrative of my life in a lot of ways. But it's been debilitating a little bit in the last few years, and I feel that I need to do more, but sometimes the energy isn't there. And it's one of the lovely things about doing this initiative this year, is because of these ideas. Maha, Mia, and I had a conversation about what we could do to foreground these kinds of issues with our students. So we started to create Equity Unbound, and it's grown and grown. But one of the most powerful aspects of it has been the emotional support from Mia and Maha during that time, because we've hit different kinds of walls of rage and emotion and so on over the past 4 or 5 months. And that kind of ongoing conversation that we have, because we're doing this Equity Unbound, has meant that, we have that mutual. So I don't know, I just want to, I was nodding when all of you were speaking, but in thinking about inequality, those are the thoughts that come to mind just tonight.
And I'll just chime in. I just wanted to quickly chime in. Oh, Sherry, sorry.
No, go ahead.
No, I just wanted to say that I wanted to second that in some way, that we had a certain intention when we came up with the notion of Equity Unbound, about growing a network and a community that was really dedicated to thinking about intercultural context for learning in an open space that is also committed to equity and empathy and dispelling or dismantling bias in learning experiences, etc. But God, so much more has come of it. And part of what has come of it is coalition and collaboration and mostly support during very painful and rageful times that we find ourselves in. So it's been an unforeseen blessing for sure.
Thank you, Mia, because I have to admit, I've kind of been late to the party. Like I knew this was happening, but I just hadn't found the time to really dig in and sort of look at sort of the strands and how they've been developed. But right now in our conversations, as I'm listening to you and I'm thinking about all of these emotions, right, that we're carrying and working with and dealing with, and what's interesting for me is I think of my mother, who grew up in the 30s, and she grew up in the South, and she never talked about it. My mother just didn't really talk about her past and her upbringing very much, and really only as I want to say in the last few years that I've really sort of spent some time thinking about what her life and the life of my father must have been like in post World War II United States. My dad was a veteran, and all of these things that remains more or less unsaid. So the history of their moving into the neighborhood where they bought a house and that was spray painted. That was before I was born, but that they were one of the first integrating families in this neighborhood. And all of the sort of inequities that they experienced just were not addressed regularly in our household. It was just sort of, it was there, but and I think a lot of that now, that I find myself turning to history, that I find myself reading more history, wanting to understand, oh my gosh, how did they survive? How did they get through this? And through the Clear the Air chat, I don't know if you follow that on Twitter, but started by Valeria Brown, that where we have a reading list, and we've gone through several books, and one of the books that we are currently looking at is History Teaches Us to Resist, and reading examples of movements and how they have started and how complex they have been, and the things that have sort of gotten in the way of progress, but simply to understand that we are not the first, we will not be the last, that our struggles are, as they're unfolding, are not necessarily the very same, but have roots, and that parts of those struggles have been overcome, but need to be overcome again and again and again. And so I think for me, this notion of what can I find out from history, and what support can I gain from that study to develop my own resilience, and also just to recognize that my parents have given me a basis for resistance and resilience and ways to move forward that I wasn't even aware of.
Sherry, I just want to say that was so beautiful. I was so moved by this idea of everyone, all of these generations of inequities and trauma, and like moving through this. And it just makes me think of a conversation I was having the other day. Something happened in the US, and I live in Canada, and I'm American, and I can't be there to support it. And I talked to somebody about it, and I said, I don't know if I want to go back. I don't know if I can get through this. And they said, well, this generation was able to get through this, and it feels bad and dark right now. And that just was really moving to me, Sherry. And I think I love this idea that we can learn from people that have come before us, and like take a step back and see the bigger picture. Because right now we're so deep in this moment, and it feels like so much weight and so intense. That's just given me a lot to move forward with my day with. So thank you.
Can I just say I'm finding it a powerful time to be teaching as well. And I teach teachers, I teach BEd students. And so next week, for instance, we're going to be joining in the Unbound EQ hashtag chat, where we're going to look at some of Zeynep Tufekci's work and talk about sort of the information ecosystem and the ways in which so much inequality is fundamentally built on these structures and intentionally moved in particular directions. But I think the other thing that I wanted to bring my students into this conversation for, with all of you and some of your students, and I encourage, we're going to be doing it over 4 days, so pop in if you can, kind of at all. It's just to give them a sense of that platform and some of the PLN, like professional learning network, building conversations that can happen in that space, as totally fraught as that space is. It's sort of me trying to build a safe scaffold for them to just get a proof of concept of how that can work, because it is what has brought me to this conversation today, which I value deeply. But beyond that, it's also the opportunity that the place that I'm working right now is not a place that where a lot of my students necessarily have sort of personal histories of oppression, well, particularly racially. There's a very different class history here, and so we're learning, we're learning to think about bias and intersectionality and social location. But if we're doing it all by ourselves without connecting out to the world and hearing different stories, then that doesn't always go as far. So finding both people and histories of educators resisting many dark times previously, and also finding people sharing in that work at this time are both really valuable things. I just want to thank you all.
When you brought up teaching, Bunny, it made me think about, I'm not teaching this semester, which is kind of nice, but I'm in conversation with my colleagues who are teaching, and it's always interesting to hear how some of the conversations around that have shifted. On the one hand, they want to bring a lot of these issues into the classroom and talk about them. And on the other hand, they're also worried that because of this particular time and the kinds of things that are emboldening certain factions of our population, that some of my colleagues and friends, and me included, are worried about going into the classroom and having to deal with some of that. So it's an interesting kind of time where on the one hand, they want to bring these issues into class. On the other hand, they're like, how do we bring these issues into class and not have one of our students stand up and say something or challenge it in a way that I may not be able to address. So at the same time as preparing for that, they're also preparing for how to deal with folks that might come in there and ask questions that in some settings or at a time would have been grossly inappropriate, but now are considered okay. And I think it's so complex. Like the more I think about things, the more complex they end up being, which is like, how are we at this point in time? In some ways, higher education has shifted how it is. It's far more commercialized now. It's far more a transactional thing that is in a capitalistic society setting rather than a knowledge exchange setting. And it's like so many of these things have changed how we interact and what we're expected to do, that, again, I'm sorry, I have to bring this word in again, everything is fraught to some degree. But it's an interesting time. Like, it's exciting to kind of think through these things, because I think there's a part of me, like you said, Bonnie, is very excited to talk about these things with younger people and students and people that we can engage with. But I can't help feeling a little like, wow, what if one of these students is someone who went to one of the talks of, I won't name any of the people on this because they should not be named, but went to a talk that had particular ideas or, push back on certain things, and now wants to come into the classroom and bring it up and challenge me. Like, so it's interesting because we have to do the work of sustaining those amongst us who require it, while also kind of dealing with or addressing some of the stuff that might harm other students in our care, if I had to say it. So we have to figure out how to care for the people who need the care, but also deal with care for those who wish harm upon us and those that we care about. That sounds complicated, but I think you understand what I'm trying to say, which is this, it's an interesting time, especially as educators, that we have to consider some of this stuff and how to deal with it.
One of the things I struggle with every semester is when we talk about issues that minorities face, and you have a very small number of minorities in the classroom, and you don't want to give them the responsibility of speaking about their issues, and at the same time you don't want others in the classroom to be speaking about their issues in insensitive ways. And this semester, for the first time, I brought a reading to base this discussion on, so that it's not just me bringing up, hey, you guys, this is happening here, because students are at AUC, where I am, it's much more comfortable for them to talk about race issues happening in the States because this is not happening to them. But when we try to talk about inequities locally and, trying to do sort of identity role plays and that kind of thing, but when we start to talk about real things that they've experienced or that they've seen happening to others, it's difficult when the minorities don't speak up as much, and there are fewer of them anyway. So even when they do speak, in turn, if they don't try to dominate the conversation, if people in the classroom don't give them space to do that, or if they don't want to do that, and their voice doesn't get heard as much. And at the same time, you want the others to consider these issues, and you don't want to force the minority to speak, to have that responsibility to educate everyone else. But so I'm still struggling with this one. I don't know what to do about it. Sometimes I talk to people outside of the classroom about it ahead of time or afterwards, but I still don't know how to deal with this issue, and I don't know if others have had anything similar or have any advice.
I'm just going to step in here for a second to add to your reflection, Maha. I'm hearing at once we as educators feel a new sense of risk in doing this kind of work, because the kinds of there's an emboldened sense of opposition to some of the kinds of values that we hope to purport regarding equity, et cetera. So there's a way in which our classroom, there might be hostile bodies in our classrooms, and we don't necessarily even know about that until we engage in discussion, and then we're also responsible for keeping those discussions civil and thoughtful and respectful. So there's risk that we feel, a kind of vulnerability. And then I also want to add to it, just anecdotally, that currently, I have students who are, I would say, profoundly vulnerable. Like one of my students shared on Twitter that her brother is enveloped in a very painful lawsuit that's very public, that has to do with explicit racism in a civic-minded orientation, like meaning as a firefighter, etc. And so I discover these things through our dialogue online. Sometimes it happens that I discover these things in the classroom as well, but the point being is I'm constantly being surprised by how much turmoil and struggle and pain my own students are going through regarding issues of equity. So at once there's this kind of step into the water that sort of we feel at risk and vulnerable, and at the same time we're constantly being reminded how important this work is, and that even just to touch upon it isn't even enough, that the conversations must become more dynamic and they're urgent. And so I'm just sharing that contemplation right now of that kind of precarious place of doing the work, needing to do the work, but then also feeling that we're at risk while we're doing that work. And I thought I might just throw out that tension to hear what you guys think about that.
So I'll jump in here. Well, there's a moment at this conference when people aren't walking behind me. I am just so thrilled. Sherry, I really appreciated your comment, feeling like, right, I kind of knew this was going on, but I had not been a part of it. I'm definitely feeling like the interloper here. But just picking up on that point, I don't think any of us have answers, but that tension and the tension between feeling vulnerable and risky, but knowing there's such an important call to do this work. And I'm at Royal Roads University, which is on the west coast of Canada. And we've just gone through a revision of our learning, teaching, and research model, which basically is the signature pedagogy that the institution subscribes to and people take up in their own ways. And one of the things that's front and center in that model in this iteration is care. And so we're now in the process of trying to take that from aspirational and pockets of what we think care looks like and try to actually drill down to, okay, what does it mean to develop a culture of care at a blended institution in fully online programs? And what does it mean to develop a culture of care when you have these equity issues and these vulnerabilities in our case, predominantly mid-career adult learners? And so I'm just raising that as I think, I don't know where it's going to go, but some really lovely people at my institution are starting to try to play with this a little bit and dissect it. And and identify some areas that maybe might be useful to try and support beyond just the average student support services that most institutions offer. The other thing I would just jump in, because again, I think these people might be walking by in a minute. One of the things that's come up, I'm at the Global Summit for Online Learning in Toronto, and one of the presentations today was about incivility in online learning. And what does it mean to be not uncivil, but incivil? And they dissected that definition and then gave examples and case studies. And it was really sobering. And I think one of the things that I walked away from that was, I think it was someone earlier who said the importance of history and the ability to look back and see that educators before us have struggled with similar things in different contexts and managed to get through some of these. And I think part of what I took away from my experience today was that need to really share these experiences, to be able to build on the history that's out there and offer some of those historical perspectives as they pull forward into our real life, ill-structured context that it is. Thank you so much for involving me, inviting me. This is a highlight of my day. Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth. I'm so glad you could make it. I'm actually kind of amazed that you're at a conference and you're taking time out to be with us. But I'm glad you could make it. I know you can't see the text chat that we're having on the side because you're on your phone, I think. And so Sava and I were kind of agreeing with what you were saying, but I bristle at the term civil and wrote the same thing, because this incivility, like for me, I'm not really sure if it's just because of my positionality, but the word civil reminds me of Orientalism, and what does civility mean to whom and who's, so but the general idea, yeah, I hear you on all that.
And I want to add to that, saying that the Orientalism and colonialism that kind of are the roots of many of everything we do right now to some degree. And I want to kind of talk about, so I'm at Queen's University, that is of a type of university, and it's located in a very loyalist kind of Anglophile area of Canada. I'm learning a lot about some of this stuff, but they've been trying, I think, to include more Indigenous voices and do things related to where we are physically and the history that went before this. And I think some of this goes to what you were saying, Sherry, as well, about historically, looking at the history of a place and what people did here and what happened here. And I attended a workshop, it's a series of workshops that's talking about decolonization. And it's an interesting, it was really, really interesting, because I think that bringing those ideas into the way we are educators right now and the kinds of educational systems that we are a part of, and this was less, it was less decolonizing and more bringing up to par other ways of learning and other ways of sharing knowledge. So it's less an approach to kind of say the way things are done now must be destroyed. It's not about destroying an existing system. It's more about giving space for the systems that the system destroyed in a way, but also kind of understanding the value in other ways of learning and being with each other. And I think in a lot of ways, these approaches are far more equitable, are far more inclusive, are far more involved with a person as a whole. And I think looking at approaches like that in terms of trying to increase sensitivity and thought processes around equity and how to bring that and how to kind of make that more real, I think I think it's really useful to do. I don't think there's enough of that happening in universities. I don't think it's happening at all in many U.S. universities. I mean, when I moved up here, it was pleasing to see that there was an effort and that there are voices here that are being given not enough space. That is for sure, but there is a voice that I'm hearing, and it's been eye-opening to me in some ways to be exposed to other ways of approaching some of the questions that we're talking about, and that very much I think at the core are very spiritual, are very connected to things, and having a different approach to thinking about these things is very, very useful. And I think that's, I'm throwing that out there as a way to kind of, for us to think about how do we approach these topics from perspectives that are not the ones that we're forced to be in right now. Like the system of higher education academia right now is a very specific thing. And how do we bring these other ways of seeing into it in order to push back on some of this and kind of see where the complements are, where we need to kind of fix things in one or the other to make it more inclusive and more just nicer. I know that's a very like basic word, but I think it's a word that actually has a lot of weight and just make things nicer.
I just wanted to jump in and add, it's interesting to hear your perspective on some of the reconciliation and decolonization efforts being made in Canadian higher ed, because, you know, at the same time, I recognize that they don't go very far. And I've certainly been in lots of them that end up feeling awkward and token. And I think to circle back to the equity conversation, one of the things that has made some of them that I've been present for somewhat limited is you can create space for new narratives, but unless you're actually doing the unpacking of the old power structures and narratives, then it, you know, and sometimes that's being navigated better than others. But when we're thinking about equity, some of it is unlearning as much as learning. And particularly those of us who are privileged by the power structures in whatever context we're talking about need to unlearn the things that we're just used to, that are just the water we've always swum in. I'm not even going to try. Is that swam or swum? I don't know.
Swam, I guess.
The water we swim in. And so it would be good, you know, to see that unlearning always be part of equity conversations.
I was, you know, as Sava was talking about this and then Bonnie talking about it now, I remembered something Stephen Brookfield wrote once about what happens when you want to introduce new viewpoints or worldviews into a conversation, is that sometimes you need to remove the dominant perspective altogether to give enough room for everything else, because the dominant, everyone's already hearing it outside the classroom all the time anyway. So if you have it next to everything else, you're saying they're both equally legitimate and just having a conversation, bringing this other thing in. But the dominant will still, this will probably go out thinking the same thing with the dominant. But removing it completely from a conversation in order to have a different conversation kind of helps with this unlearning a little bit, is that you have to remove this for now and then talk about something else. But on the other hand, the idea of decolonizing is difficult to achieve in the sense that people who have been colonized for years were not pure at any point in their lives. That a lot of them were never these pure people who did not have the colonizer influence. And so going back to some sort of pure ideal, I mean, Homi Bhabha talks about this, is that they are already hybrids, and trying to say, let's go back to this origin that doesn't actually resonate with them becomes a problem as well. So I'm not really sure where I'm going with this, just that it's complicated, I guess, and that this unlearning is not just something that I think the colonizer needs to do, but also the actual colonized or oppressed themselves may not even recognize what happens at the end of this unlearning as something that belongs to them in the first place. I don't know if this makes any sense at all. I'm going to stop.
It makes a lot of sense, Maha. And I wanted to throw out another term that I learned recently called coloniality, which is something that someone named Maldonado, I think, wrote about, which is less talking about colonialism as a thing, because every time we talk about that, we think of that as something that was in the past, whereas coloniality looks at the effects of ongoing effects of colonialism, which includes some of what you were saying, that even those of us who had been colonized have internalized a lot of this stuff. And I think what you were saying in terms of the dominant is often the default. And so even the work that we have to do to kind of unpack that and undo that. And I think, and I'm so sorry, I'm not remembering this well, but recently on Twitter, and you know how Twitter is, I saw someone talking about how decolonization is actually not a thing that can happen, because it's been done already. So I will find that tweet somehow and I will share it with you guys. But I think the idea presented by that was just like, we're not trying to decolonize, we're trying to do a different thing. And maybe it is uncolonized. I don't know if that was the term that was used, but I will find it. But just rethinking what we think of colonialism and coloniality and the effects of that. And I don't know where I was going with this either now, Maha, but basically I wanted to add to some of these ideas of just like, and sometimes I feel like even when we just say these things and discuss them with each other, it shifts us ever so little into changing that thought process and then going forward from there and being nicer. I'm back to saying nicer. Okay.
Hi. Yeah, I was just thinking as you were talking about unlearning, and the context in South African higher education is, well, interesting is one way of putting it. But some of you may know we've had 3 years of huge change in the sector due to significant student protests around not only fees and costs, but actually about curriculum, colonialism, coloniality, the day-to-day experience of students who are the majority population but are feeling or treated as minorities in historic advantaged institutions. Very, very heightened. And 3 years on, the academic staff, the professional staff are kind of really at the point of, where are we going now? Lots and lots of projects, lots and lots of initiatives have been, and are in operation. And there's actually some really good stuff coming out. It's, very early days. And there's sort of two aspects that I'd like to just touch upon. One is almost like counting the cost on people, like what has happened, and actually taking stock and acknowledging it. While, overall being grateful in some ways that it's happened in a very brutal way. There's a lot of trauma amongst the sort of, staff and student body still. But the other aspect is around language and unlearning. You could take away perhaps, but then you have to, you can introduce new language so that people have something to hook, new hooks. New ways of being able to express what we want to say, and that's what I found quite empowering, is that once we can start talking in new terms with new frameworks, that the conversations change. But it's difficult because you can be one person or two people and you do the research and you do the reading, but how do you embed that more? Generally, even within teams and departments. So I'd really be interested to hear if people have got any ideas around that.
I wish I could say that I had ideas. but one of the things that I was thinking of earlier is this notion of something that I find that I am interested in, is curiosity, and how do we foster curiosity, and that seems to be one of the things that is lacking. It's incuriosity is something that I think is rampant, and that is sort of the base of also so many fears, right? I'm afraid of something, but I also don't want to investigate. I don't want to interrogate what that fear is about and where it's coming from. And another piece of that is I find that I struggle from a true lack of imagination. I can identify what's bothering me, what's scaring me, but I am so I simply lack the capacity to envision what could be, what might be, what would the better, what is a decolonialized state? What is, I'm frustrated by that. I find myself frustrated again and again that I feel that I lack the imaginative resources to envision what could be. And my best solution so far has been to seek out those who do have that, who manage that. And that has been helpful, but at the same time, I think what I've committed to is to remaining curious. So reading the authors that I haven't read, reading Native perspectives has helped me sort of place Black struggle into a different context and see it differently. So it's a long process and it's exhausting, but I keep going. So I don't have an answer for that, but yeah.
Sherry, oh, go ahead, Catherine.
Oh, sorry. No, you popped in there first. I'll follow you. That's fine.
Okay. Yeah, I was going to say, I love this idea of curiosity. And I think something that I wanted to add to that is that I think it's really important to be curious and to not have to reconcile the things that you learn, like to take the moment to go and seek new information and let, new things sit with you and see where they contradict your prior knowledge and see where they intersect with your prior knowledge, and not, and try to avoid meaning making at the beginning and just let yourself absorb and be a sponge. And that I think one of the things that I've encountered a lot recently is the idea that if there is a negative experience that you encounter, an inequity that you encounter, that suddenly that entire experience becomes about that one part of it, or you learn one new thing and suddenly it's all you can see is in that space. And remaining curious and remaining open to being multifaceted and to living in this multifaceted world and educating in a complex system and not having to distill that into a single thing is difficult. But I think it's if people can do that, then we might be able to at least start to see where dialogue can happen.
Thank you. I feel my brain and my heart are exploding right now after this conversation, and I know we're near the end of the hour, but one reflection I had, and Sava and Sherry and all of the guests here tonight, thank you so much. One reflection I have is that, this conversation has been filled with some of the people who, for me, are the beacons of doing this work. And what I've heard nearly every person say is what a struggle it is. I mean, a daily, really difficult struggle. And that is the work, I suppose. I mean, if it is a struggle for us, then we know we're doing what we need to do. So, Sherry, I'm just remembering a post you wrote, I don't know, a year or 2 years ago about how positive Twitter was for you. Because our networks can be very toxic and they can be engines of inequality, but they can also sustain us in ways. And that's why we're really all here in this gathering tonight, is because of our networks. So I think just the other thing I would like to say is that I hope we're not too hard on ourselves. If we don't have a firm vision, if the work is difficult, that's okay. Because I think we're all doing the work that needs to be done, and let's keep doing it together. And the mantra that I keep saying to everyone in the last few months is just take care of yourselves and take care of each other. So, I just want to express that to you all.
Thank you, Catherine. And I think that's a really good note to close on. And it's not the end of this conversation. We just have to close up because there's 3 of us where it's 11 p.m. right now. So equity-wise and well-being-wise, we need to get going. But thank you all so much for this beautiful conversation. And let's keep talking about this. I think a lot of us wouldn't survive without the support we give each other. And definitely a lot of the people in this room are the people who've been supporting me for the past few years. I wouldn't be able to just keep going, I think, without this. So thank you so much for taking the time to be with us today. And the recording is going to be up on our website. And if you want to blog or tweet, any remaining thoughts you have, we can still keep talking about it. Thank you so much. I'm going to get offline.
Thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.